Ain't you the little whore who was begging outside the mercantile last week?" The drunk's words hit Marlowe like a slap. She'd been celebrating, finally had a job, finally had hope, and now this stranger was dragging her back to the worst moment of her life. The moment she'd offered herself to a cowboy for one night of shelter. But what happened next? That cowboy didn't take what she offered. Instead, he gave her something she'd forgotten existed. And 6 months later, she'd have to decide, could she ever trust a man again? This is her story. Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, or evening in Paris, tell me where you are. Now let's go back to where it all started. Marlowe's knees buckled as she clutched the wooden post outside the mercantile. 3 days without food had turned her legs to water. The October wind cut through her threadbare dress, and she could taste copper in her mouth, blood from cracked lips or the ghost of her last meal, she couldn't tell. Through the shop window, she watched families buying flour, sugar, coffee. A little girl pressed her nose against the glass, licking a peppermint stick. Marlowe's stomach twisted so violently she doubled over. She'd walked 17 miles from the dried-up homestead where her husband's body still lay beneath a cairn of stones. No money, no family, no options, just the howling emptiness of the Kansas prairie and the certainty that tonight, without shelter, the cold would finish what starvation had started. That's when she saw him, a lone rider, tall and weathered, tying his horse to the hitching post. His coat was worn but clean, his boots still had their shine, and there was something about the careful way he moved, like a man who'd learned to carry his own weight without complaint. He glanced at her once, then away, the way decent people do when they see suffering they can't fix. But Marlowe was past shame, past pride. She pushed off the post and stumbled toward him, her vision swimming. When she opened her mouth to speak, what came out wasn't a plea, it was a transaction. Raw, desperate, honest. She told him she had nothing to offer but herself, that one night of warmth and food would be enough to reach the next town, maybe find work. Her voice cracked on the word work, and she hated how small it made her feel. The stranger's face didn't change. He studied her with gray eyes that had seen too much to be shocked by anything. Then he did something she didn't expect. He took off his coat and draped it over her shoulders. The warmth of it, still holding his body heat, made her throat close up. "Name's Callum," he said quietly. "I got a camp about 5 miles west. Fire's already going. There's stew." He didn't wait for her answer, just untied his horse and started walking, leading the mare by the reins. Marlowe stood frozen for a heartbeat, drowning in confusion. He hadn't touched her, hadn't leered, hadn't negotiated. He just walked away, expecting her to follow. She looked down at the coat, felt its weight, and something inside her, something she thought had died with her husband, stirred. She followed. They walked in silence, the only sound the crunch of frost beneath their boots and the mare's steady breathing. Marlowe kept waiting for the other shoe to drop, for him to name his price, state his terms. But Callum just kept walking, occasionally glancing back to make sure she was still there. Once, when she stumbled on a root, he slowed his pace without a word. The sun was setting when they reached his camp, a neat arrangement beside a creek. A canvas tent, a fire ring with a pot suspended over flames, 2 bedrolls laid out on opposite sides of the fire. He gestured to one. "That one's yours," he said, and began ladling stew into a tin bowl. Marlowe took it with shaking hands, and when the first bite hit her tongue, venison, potatoes, actual salt, she started crying. Not pretty tears, ugly, gasping sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken. Callum turned away, giving her privacy, and fed his horse. That night Marlowe lay in the bedroll he'd given her, staring at the stars through the gap in the tent flap. Across the fire, Callum's breathing was slow and even. He hadn't asked her story, hadn't asked her name, hadn't asked for anything at all. The coat still smelled like leather and wood smoke and something else, safety maybe, or kindness. She didn't have words for it. But as sleep finally pulled her under, full and warm for the first time in a week, one thought circled in her mind. Who was this man? And why, in a world that had taught her to expect nothing, had he given her everything she needed without asking for a single thing in return? Tomorrow, she promised herself, she'd find out. Tomorrow she'd understand. But tonight she just let herself rest. Morning came soft and gold. Marlo woke to the smell of coffee and cornbread, and for a disorienting moment she thought she was back in the homestead before everything fell apart. Then she saw Callum crouched by the fire, turning cornbread in a skillet, and reality snapped back. He handed her a cup without meeting her eyes. "There's a creek 20 yards south if you want to wash up," he said. "I'll keep the fire going." It was the same careful distance from yesterday, like he was determined to give her space even in this small camp. Marlo took the coffee, real coffee, not the chicory water she'd been drinking for months, and felt that strange tightness in her chest again. She'd spent the whole night waiting for the moment he'd collect what she'd offered, but sunrise had come and gone, and he'd asked for nothing. At the creek she scrubbed her face and hands with freezing water, trying to wash away more than just trail dust. When she returned, Callum had laid out breakfast: cornbread, dried apples, more coffee. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who'd both learned that words could be dangerous, that sometimes quiet was safer. Finally, Marlo broke it. "Why?" she asked. Just that. One word. Callum looked up from his plate, and for the first time she saw something flicker in those gray eyes, recognition maybe, understanding. He set down his coffee cup and stared into the fire. "Had a sister once," he said slowly. "Lily. She was 16 when our parents died of fever. I was away, working a cattle drive in Texas. By the time I got home, she'd been alone for 3 months." His voice went flat, distant. "Town folks said she'd gone wild. Said she'd been seen with different men, trading what she had for what she needed. I found her living in an abandoned shack, half-starved, wearing a dress that didn't fit. She looked at me like I was gonna hit her, like she'd forgotten what it was to have someone just care." He paused, jaw working. "Took me 2 years to get her back. To teach her she was worth more than what men would pay for. She's in Colorado now, married to a good man, got 2 bobbies, but I remember the look in her eyes that day, and I swore," his voice cracked, "I swore I'd never let another woman look at me like that, like she'd already decided what I wanted before I'd even opened my mouth." Marlo's hands were shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Don't be," Callum said. "You did what you had to. I'm just trying to do what I should." For the first time, Marlo really looked at him. Saw the lines around his mouth, the silver threading through his dark hair, the careful way he moved, like a man who'd learned to be gentle after a lifetime of hardness. "My husband died 6 weeks ago," she said, surprising herself. "Pneumonia. We were sharecropping, barely making it. After he passed, the landowner took everything. Said I owed him for seeds, tools, time. I walked away with my dress and my shoes." She laughed, bitter. "Didn't even have the shoes anymore. Soul came off outside Wichita." Callum didn't offer sympathy, just nodded. "What's your name?" he asked. "Marlo," she said. "Marlo Finch." He extended a hand. "Callum Brody." They shook formally, like two people meeting for the first time. In a way, they were. That afternoon, Callum taught her how to set snares for rabbits. Showed her which plants were edible, which would make her sick. He didn't talk much, but his actions said everything. This is how you survive. This is how you keep going. And Marlo, who'd spent weeks feeling like a ghost, started to feel solid again, started to feel possible. When evening came and they sat by the fire again, Callum finally asked, "Where were you headed?" Marlo stared at the flames. "Dodge City. Heard they need seamstresses." He nodded slowly. "I'm going through there, heading to my sister's place in Colorado for the winter. You're welcome to ride along. I got supplies and the company wouldn't hurt." It wasn't charity. It was an offer between equals. And for the first time since her husband died, Marlo smiled. A real smile. "I'd like that," she said. "I'd like that a lot." They traveled together for 3 days, falling into an easy rhythm. Callum would scout ahead while Marlo tended the horse and packed camp. He taught her to shoot his rifle, standing behind her and adjusting her stance without ever making her uncomfortable. She mended a tear in his saddlebag, her fingers remembering the skills she'd learned as a girl. They were becoming a team, something neither had expected. On the 3rd night, they made camp near a dried riverbed, and Callum shot 2 prairie chickens. As they cooked over the fire, Marlo asked the question that had been gnawing at her. "Why are you alone?" Callum turned the spit slowly. "I was married once," he said. "Her name was Claire. We had a ranch in Montana. Good land, good water. Then the winter of '86 hit. His hands stilled. Lost 90% of the herd. Lost the ranch. Lost Claire. She got sick that spring and I didn't have money for a doctor. I was holding her hand when she died and all I could think was that I'd failed. That I'd promised to take care of her and I couldn't even keep her warm. The pain in his voice was so raw that Marlo reached out without thinking, putting her hand over his. Callum looked down at their joined hands, surprised. Then slowly, he turned his palm up and squeezed. They sat like that for a long moment, two people who'd lost everything, holding onto each other in the firelight. "I'm sorry," Marlo said. "Me too," Callum replied. "But Claire wouldn't want me living in the past. She'd want me to keep going, so that's what I do." Marlo thought about her own husband, about the last words he'd said, "Take care of yourself, keep living." The next day they reached Dodge City. The streets were crowded with cowboys, merchants, families. Marlo felt small and dirty in her worn dress, but Callum walked beside her like she was someone important. They found a boarding house first. Callum paid for 2 rooms, one for her, one for him. "Take a bath, get some rest," he said, pressing coins into her hand. "I'll meet you for supper." In her room, Marlo stared at the bed, the wash basin, the window with actual glass. She drew a bath and sank into it, crying again, but this time from relief, from gratitude, from the overwhelming realization that she was going to survive. That night at supper, Callum told her he'd found a seamstress shop that needed help. "Owner's name is Mrs. Harriet Boone. She's a widow, fair employer. I told her about you. She wants to meet tomorrow." Marlo's throat closed. "You did that for me?" Callum shrugged. "Figured you'd want to know your options." She reached across the table and took his hand, not caring who saw. "Thank you," she said, "for everything, for seeing me as more than." She couldn't finish. Callum squeezed her hand. "You were always more," he said quietly. "Some people just forget to look." They finished their meal in comfortable silence, and when they walked back to the boarding house, Marlo noticed something had shifted between them. The careful distance was still there, but now it felt like respect rather than fear, like trust rather than caution. At her door, Callum tipped his hat. "Sleep well, Marlo." She caught his sleeve before he could leave. "Will you stay in Dodge for a while?" He smiled, a real smile that reached his eyes. "For a while," he promised. That night, Marlo lay in a real bed for the first time in months and thought about how far she'd come. From that mercantile post, starving and desperate, to this. A job prospect, a clean room, and a man who'd shown her what kindness looked like without asking for anything in return. She thought about Callum's sister, about Claire, about all the women who'd walked this same edge between survival and surrender. And she made herself a promise. She would never forget what it felt like to be seen, to be valued. And someday, when she had the means, she'd be the one offering shelter to someone who needed it. She'd be the one saying, "You're worth more than this." Outside, church bells chimed midnight. Marlo closed her eyes and for the first time in a long time dreamed of the future instead of running from the past. Marlo met Mrs. Boone the next morning. The woman was sharp-eyed and efficient, testing Marlo's stitching, her pattern cutting, her attention to detail. After an hour, she nodded curtly. "You'll do. 6 days a week, room and board included above the shop. Start Monday." Marlo's hands shook as she signed the employment agreement. She had a job, a future. When she emerged onto the street, Callum was waiting, leaning against a post, whittling a piece of wood. "Well?" he asked. Marlo's smile said everything. Callum grinned and tucked the wood away. "Come on," he said. "Let's celebrate." They went to a small restaurant, ordered steak and potatoes, and talked about everything and nothing. Marlo told him about her childhood in Ohio, her love of sewing, the wedding dress she'd made for herself. Callum talked about Montana, about his sister's letters, about the small ranch he hoped to buy someday. It was the most normal afternoon Marlo had experienced in years, and she treasured every second. But that evening, as they walked back through town, a man stepped into their path. He was drunk, swaying, with mean eyes and a sneer. "Well, well," he slurred, looking Marlo up and down. "Ain't you the little whore who was begging outside the mercantile last week?" Marlo went rigid. Callum stepped between them immediately, his hand moving to his hip. "Walk away," he said, voice low and dangerous. The drunk laughed. "What's she yours now? You pay for the whole night." What happened next was so fast Marlo almost missed it. Callum's fist connected with the man's jaw, a single, clean punch that dropped him like a stone. Callum stood over him, breathing hard. "She's not for sale," he said. "Never was, and if I hear you say otherwise, we'll have a longer conversation." He took Marlowe's arm gently, always gently, and led her away. Marlowe was shaking, but not from fear, from rage, from humiliation, from the sick realization that no matter how far she ran, that moment outside the mercantile would follow her. "I'm sorry," she choked out. "I'm so sorry you had to." Callum stopped walking and turned to face her. "Listen to me," he said, and his voice was fierce. "You did nothing wrong. You were surviving. There's no shame in that. None." Tears spilled down her cheeks. "But he saw me. He knows what I offered." Callum cupped her face in his rough hands, making her look at him. "I don't care what he knows. I don't care what anyone thinks. I know who you are. A woman who's brave enough to keep going when the world's trying to break her. A woman who's strong enough to ask for help when she needs it. That's who I see." Marlowe broke then, sobbing into his chest while he held her, right there in the middle of the street. When she finally pulled back, Callum wiped her tears with his thumbs. "I have to leave soon," he said quietly. "Winter's coming and my sister's expecting me." Marlowe nodded, trying to steady herself. "I know, but I'll come back in the spring," he continued. "I promise. And when I do," he hesitated, then smiled. "When I do, maybe we can have dinner again, just like today." Marlowe understood what he wasn't saying, that he wanted more than friendship, but he'd wait. That he respected her enough to give her time to heal, to build herself back up before asking for anything. "I'd like that," she whispered. Callum nodded and released her, stepping back to that careful distance. But something had changed. The space between them wasn't empty anymore. It was full of possibility. Callum left 3 days later. Marlowe stood at the edge of town, watching him ride west, and she didn't cry. She waved until he was just a speck on the horizon, then turned back to her new life. To the seamstress shop where Mrs. Boone was already calling her the best hire she'd ever made. To the small room above the shop where she kept Callum's coat, carefully folded at the foot of her bed. To the future she was building, one stitch at a time. That night she wrote him a letter, knowing it would be weeks before he received it. In it she thanked him for seeing her, for reminding her what kindness looked like. And she promised that when he came back she'd be ready. Not because she owed him, but because she wanted to be. The woman she was becoming, strong, independent, whole, wanted to know the man who'd helped her remember she was worth saving. Winter in Dodge City was brutal but purposeful. Marlowe worked 12-hour days, her hands flying over fabric, creating wedding dresses, Sunday suits, children's clothes. She saved every penny, lived simply, and slowly built a life that was entirely her own. Mrs. Boone became a friend, teaching her not just sewing but bookkeeping, customer relations, business sense. By March, Marlowe was managing the shop 3 days a week. She rented a small house, bought a second-hand sewing machine, started taking private commissions. The frightened, starving woman who'd stumbled into Callum's path was gone, replaced by someone stronger, someone who knew her own worth. Callum's letters came monthly, full of stories about his sister's family, the Colorado winter, the small piece of land he'd found. He never pushed, never demanded, just wrote like a friend who cared. Marlowe wrote back, sharing her victories, her struggles, the life she was building. She signed each letter the same way, waiting for spring. April arrived with wildflowers and warm wind. Marlowe was in the shop hemming a dress when the bell above the door chimed. She looked up and there he was, Callum Brodie, hat in hand, looking nervous for the first time since she'd known him. "Hello, Marlowe," he said. She set down her needle carefully, walked around the counter and stopped just in front of him. He looked good, healthy, rested, hopeful. "Hello, Callum," she replied. They stood there drinking each other in, and Marlowe realized she wasn't afraid anymore. Not of him, not of what people might think, not of needing someone, because she didn't need him. She chose him. There was a difference. "I kept my promise," Callum said. "Came back for that dinner." Marlowe smiled. "I kept mine too. I'm ready." Understanding dawned in his gray eyes. He offered his arm, she took it, and they walked out into the spring sunshine together. Over dinner, they talked about the future. Callum had bought the Colorado land, had plans for a small ranch. Marlowe told him about her dream of opening her own dress shop, maybe in a town that needed one. "Colorado needs a good seamstress," Callum said carefully. "If you were interested." Marlowe met his eyes. "Is that an offer or a proposal?" Callum laughed, relieved. "I'm not sure yet. Ask me in 6 months. They courted properly after that: walks, dinners, church on Sundays. Callum visited Dodge City every other week, and Marlo traveled to Colorado twice to meet his sister Lily, who hugged her like family from the first moment. In August, Callum asked her to marry him, presenting a simple gold band he'd commissioned from a jeweler. Marlo said yes without hesitation, not because she needed rescuing, but because she wanted partnership. Because they'd both learned that the strongest foundations were built on respect, trust, and the willingness to see each other clearly. They married in September in a small church with Lily and Mrs. Boone as witnesses. Marlo wore a dress she'd sewn herself, simple, elegant, perfect. Callum wore his best suit and couldn't stop smiling. When the preacher asked if he took this woman, Callum's voice was strong and sure. "I do." And when Marlo said the same, she meant it with everything she was. That night at the hotel, Callum gave her one more gift, the piece of wood he'd been whittling the day she got the job. It was a small bird, wings spread mid-flight. "You were always going to fly," he said. "I just wanted to make sure you had somewhere safe to land when you needed to rest." Marlo held the carving to her chest, overwhelmed. She'd been so close to giving up, so close to believing she was worth nothing. And then this man had shown her different, not with grand gestures, but with steady kindness. With seeing her when she felt invisible. They moved to Colorado in October, to the ranch Callum had built and the dress shop Marlo opened in town. It wasn't easy. Ranching never was, and building a business from scratch took years. But they did it together, weathering droughts and hard winters and the 100 small crises that make up a life. They had 3 children, taught them to be kind, to help those who needed it, to never judge someone by their worst moment. And every year on the anniversary of the night they met, Callum would tell their children the story, how their mother had been the bravest woman he'd ever known, and how one night of shelter had changed both their lives forever. Marlo would add her own ending, that sometimes the darkest moments lead to the brightest futures, that asking for help isn't weakness, it's wisdom, and that the truest measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they do when they have nothing left to give. Their love, built on that foundation, lasted 53 years, and when Marlo died, peaceful in her sleep with Callum holding her hand, the wooden bird was still on her bedside table, a reminder that she'd flown and loved and lived fully. That one night of shelter had indeed changed everything. If this story touched your heart, drop a comment below. Tell me what resonated with you. And remember, you're worth more than your worst day. Always.